Hi, everyone, and welcome to part two of a Keating family history of immigration from Ireland to New York City. I'm Natalie Keating, and I'm here today with my uncle, Dr. Joe Keating, who has done extensive research on our family's history that we would like to share with you all. So we're excited to be here today to share more about what life may have been like for our relatives when they first arrived in New York City. So, like many immigrant families, they faced many obstacles leaving home behind, starting over with very little, facing discrimination, disease, trying to build a life completely in a new place. But through their hard work and faith and support from family and community, they made it through those struggles, created opportunities for the generations that came after them, all of us. So, today we will talk more about everyday life, what it was like for our family and Irish immigrants in New York City, their neighborhoods, churches they went to, communities that they built, and we'll also share some places like local churches, Irish pubs, and the Tenement Museum for anyone who may want to visit and get a better sense of what that experience was like. So we're very happy to share this with all of you and keep our family's story alive. And thank you to Uncle Joe for your research and interest in our family history.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. So, adding something that I left off with the last time in part one was that John Keating, the number one, like many immigrants, was subject to a lot, as Natalie alluded to very well, all the different obstacles. And started with a famine. Life was poor. Many people died in the famine, and he survived it. Somebody gave him enough money, or he earned enough money to come over here. Went on a ship. They call them ghost ships or famine ships because one third of them died on the ship's voyage, 8 weeks across the ocean. He survived that. He got to New York City, uh, found a place to live, found a job, and then was able to make a living there in New York City with his family. So that's where we're at. So he had a lot of obstacles. In order for us to be here today to do this as ancestors, he being one of the ancestors, he allowed us to be here today basically by coming to New York City. So anyway, what was life like in New York City? Well, he lived in a tenement. He lived on Second Avenue, 19th Street, which I showed on a map the last time, I believe. Lower, there it is, right there near Gramercy Park. It's on the eastern part of Lower Manhattan, near the docks and so forth. There was a large co-op, series of co-ops there, so he must have lived in one of those co-op cities, which were 4 or 5 stories high. And his wife came over. I mentioned this. His wife came over a year or two later, 1851, and she came over with their first son, Arthur, and so she joined him a year or so after he arrived. So anyway, settled here on 19th Street, Second Avenue, near Gramercy Park. And what was life like? I mean, how did he make a living? How much did he make? How much did she make? How much did it cost to live there? What kind of food did they eat? What did they did for social life? All those things Natalie very well represented in the beginning there as her overview. So the first thing I'll mention is what was the rent? How much did it cost? Now it varied, but according to the Tenement Museum, it was about $10 or $15 a month rent for 3 bedrooms, which are about 350 feet. They usually had one room, one stove in the middle, perhaps 2 or 3 bedrooms, and weren't very well ventilated. Very hot in the summer. They would live out on little porches that came off there sometimes in the summer. So it wasn't. They didn't have air conditioning. They didn't have regular heat. Probably subject to a lot of fumes and so forth from the stoves. Anyway, that was $15, $10 to $15, and they would earn about $1. The men are as a common laborer, bricklayer, working on the docks, whatever. They earned about $1 a day, 5 days, maybe 6 days a week, but not on Sunday. And so maybe $20 a week, a month. I'm sorry, $20 a month was their salary. And the women would earn 50 cents to 80 cents on an average for housekeeping, doing laundry, babysitting, cleaning, working in a factory. So they earned about a half a dollar a day. So that means they would probably get on a 20 day month, $10 to $12 a month. So that means their total income was in the vicinity of $30. So about half of their money was for rent in that ballpark.
Wow.
And sometimes they get laid off in the winter. They talked about them in the cold weather. They wouldn't work, so they wouldn't get paid. So they would take in tenants sometimes just to give them a bed, and they charge tenants $3 or $4 a month to have a bed. Uh, I assume they fed them too, but at any rate, that would offset sometimes. And then the young children, a lot of them went to school maybe here, but when they were in like third or fourth grade, 10, 12 years old, they went to work also. So it was a family affair to make enough money to cover that. So that's the cost of it. And then food. What did they eat? They ate better probably than they did in Ireland, certainly during the famine. They would eat things like some of the cheaper cuts of fish and meat. Corned beef was a new staple that they didn't have in Ireland. Maybe some chicken, but a lot of root products like cabbage and carrots and onions, oats, a lot of oatmeal. So they would buy oats. And in the articles about them, they talked about the women would try to go out and get maybe some of the off pieces, the scraps of beef and so forth. They were sold cheaper, so the corned beef might be cheaper if it was the end of it or whatever, a lot more fat. So they tried to get that. But what I thought was very interesting is milk became a staple, which it wasn't in Ireland, which is as a little sidebar to that. A lot of Eastern Europeans or Western Europeans, excuse me, Ireland, England, have a milk allergy, and so they didn't have milk there much, but they did in the United States. So that probably increased the number of allergies. I hadn't thought of that before, but 60 to 80 cents a week. So of their budget for food, the budget was about 350 to 450 a week. So that means there's about 12 to 13, $14 a month for food. And out of that, 80 cents a week, three of those dollars, or let's see, that's about 1/5 of their total food budget was for milk. So that's interesting. So milk they didn't have in Ireland, they did have it in New York City, but it was a very expensive part of their food. There was a lot of room for contamination, obviously. They bought this food in outdoor markets, and it could have been contaminated with bacteria. Also, they drank water or beer, whatever, and the water could have been contaminated. The milk could have been contaminated because a lot of it was not pasteurized at that time. So those are all other sources of getting sick. Okay, so that's the living conditions. Natalie, got a question?
Yes, I do. Could you tell us a little bit more about these living conditions? Like, I know we have some pictures here from the Tenement Museum, and I
Right.
wanted to also
Yep.
mention
Yep.
to everyone, if you do want to go down to New York City and see what an example of an apartment might have been like for Irish immigrants, they do have a specific Irish family, which you can sign up for that tour and go visit.
Right. That's I've been there. It's wonderful, and you can see from Natalie's pictures here, there might be 6 or 8 people in one room, all over the place, and some of them even have kind of like soot on their face. That's probably from the fires, I imagine. But very cramped quarters. If one person was sick, they could spread it real easily. Any kind of diseases that were contagious, such as measles, chickenpox, they could kill you. And so we had a lot of the average life expectancy. I think I mentioned this before, was like 40 to 45 years old in that time period. A lot of that was due to illnesses. They contracted it from other people, from the water, from the food. These living conditions, as you see here, were not very good at that point.
Okay.
So that's living conditions. Yeah, that's right.
So you mentioned work, and I'm curious about this. You said even the women and children were sometimes working. So we'll transition
Right.
into talk a little bit about the kind of work that Irish immigrants did generally. And we have a picture here of John too in the customs office in New York City. But tell us a little bit about what work was like for them then.
Right. And so just to focus on his picture there for a second, John Keating too, born in 1857. So he was born in New York City to them. Arthur, his brother, was born in Ireland. And John too, you see he's all dressed up in that picture. He has his own office. So he has a pretty good job. And I know from the records, he earned about $2,000 in the year 1900. So he was 43 years old at that point. That's a lot of money in those days. That represents probably, I think it said 50 to 60,000 in today's wages. So that was pretty good. And he worked in a customs office, so bringing in products and people from other countries. He worked in the office. I don't know exactly what he did. That's something I have to do more research. But backtracking, so he must have had more education. He must have read and write. We know that. Did he have more than eighth grade? Maybe. But anyway, backtracking to John 1, and the question Natalie came up with is, what jobs did they have? Well, again, the men typically were basic laborers, common laborers, and they would load stuff off the docks. That was one job. They would carry bricks for assembly. They would build bridges and do all kinds of stuff. Risky, some of them very risky, so they could get hurt or killed that way too. So the women, they did jobs like housekeeping for other people that were wealthier. And they also did things like doing laundry, taking care of children, babysitting, working in factories. And all of those paid around 50, averaged about 50 cents to 80 cents a day. So that means they probably earned about $10 to $12 a month. The husband earned around $20 a month. So the total income at that point would be in the vicinity of, maybe $30 a month. And there are other jobs, and some in the record, some Irish people had some skills. And for example, one of the family members, which we haven't mentioned yet, he was an undertaker, and he would have made more money an hour, a lot more money. And so, if they had a skill, very few of them did. Most of them were common laborers, as Natalie mentioned. I believe the last one, 80% of the workforce in New York City was Irish. So 80% of them were Irish, and these are the laborers that earn not much more than $1 an hour. Most of them were that. Okay. Um, so those are the types of jobs. They were risky, dangerous in some cases. They weren't. They got laid off in the winter sometimes because it was cold, so they weren't working in the winter. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes they took in boarders to those tenements to earn a little extra money, and they shared food and so forth. So I imagine that in the tenement, I imagine it based on what I've read is that a lot of the people helped each other as much as they could. And there were churches that probably helped. They went to church. There was churches probably helped with some people that needed more food. And the children went to work as early as they could to bring in more money. So if you had two kids, you had two more laborers. It depends on how old they were, how much money they earned. So it was a real tenuous month. They lived month to month, as many people do today. There was not much saved. They talked about people saving money. Very few people could save money, but there were some that had better jobs that were able to save money and send it back to their relatives in Ireland. So anyway, that's kind of the economic situation.
So
Okay, does
they
that?
were,
Yeah,
yeah, thank you for that. So they were obviously working extremely hard. And I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about what they did to balance all of that out for socialization, which brings us to our next slide.
right. Yeah, and this McSorley's Old Ale House was mentioned quite frequently. It was right. It was in about 3 or 4 blocks of where they lived. So I assume that the male members of these families would go there often, or when they could, or when they could afford it. And the ale house, beer house, bar, basically no women allowed. Big sign there in front. 1855, it was opened. It's still open today. We have some actual pictures inside too to show you what it looks like. So you could actually visit that pub, and that's where the men went. And they probably exchanged stories, talked about the past, talked about what information they were getting from Ireland and the newspapers, the ones that were reading it, and so forth. The Irish News was a newspaper that many people that could read in New York City would read and talk about what was going on back in Ireland. So they probably sang, told stories, dancing maybe, but there were no women allowed. So the women typically would be at home or socializing with other women, and they were doing some of the same things, telling stories, dancing, talking about gossiping, talking about what was going on, and so forth. And so anyway, that the socialization was probably limited to attendance at these ale houses, beer houses, bars, whatever. The women were, they'd be working, probably talking and dancing and Irish dancing. They had storytelling, poetry, and so forth. Uh, so that was part of socialization. And for the children, we want to mention this now, but the children, uh, in many cases in Ireland, they did not attend schools. There were some available, and they were not very good, and very few people attended it. They were just trying to survive. But when they came to the United States, there was public schools and it was private schools. In the private schools, there was a lot of racism towards the Irish. They were considered lower class citizens by the Protestants. So there's a lot of Protestant, just like in Ireland in modern times, the Protestants versus the Catholics. A lot of that, they were bullied a lot and so forth in these public schools. So many of them went to private schools, mostly Catholic. Each diocese would have a number of larger ones, and then the smaller churches would have some too. Most of them went to eighth grade. Most people didn't go beyond that. Uh, this is a couple of them there. St. Bridget's, and that is on the right, I believe. And the one on the left opened a little later, 1790, 1879, Old St. Patrick's. They were both called famine churches because most of the attendees were Irish, Catholic, people that had come over, immigrated over from Ireland. So that also was a piece of that socialization. The churches, I'm sure, had dinners and dances and as a way for them to congregate. I'm sure they probably attended the one on the left when they first got there, and maybe the one on the right later. I'm not sure. John the John the First had passed away by 1873, so he certainly didn't see that one. But his wife could have. She died later, 1892, I believe. So anyway, that was another socialization besides the religious aspect of attending church and marriages and funerals and so forth.
Mm.
So that was the churches they probably attended. Here's like some pictures that we were just talking about. The average age of an Irish immigrant education in 1860 was sixth grade, third grade, sixth grade, enough to read and write and then go to work. And this is a picture here of a public school and quite crowded. Uh, the basics, reading, writing, and very discipline orientated. A lot of in those days they did do a lot of paddling and swatting and so forth. So it was sort of a no nonsense type of situation. Students probably didn't get a chance to talk much. So summary education, a lot of racism um, in the public schools between the Irish and Protestant. A lot of them went on to Catholic schools, at least through sixth grade. That was the average. And these schools were spread out throughout New York City. Some were diocesan, some were just
Hmm.
local schools. Run by the nuns. Yeah, run by the nuns. Okay, so that gives you an idea. That's part of the socialization too. The children, obviously, and all of them, the churches, the bars, the informal meetings between the women and so forth.
Great, thank you for that. Interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about the Civil War draft riots?
Yeah, they call them the race riots, draft riots, Civil War draft riot here pictured here. Um, the riots. First of all, backing a little bit up, 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln won as president. And if you look at the voting rolls in New York City, the Irish voters voted about 80% against Lincoln and 20% for Lincoln. So there was not any love lost for Lincoln because they felt that if Lincoln, once the Civil War was starting, they thought that if the United States government won that war, the slaves would be freed and they would be allowed to move in different directions, including New York City, to get jobs. And they were afraid that their jobs would be taken away. A little bit the comparison today might be the AI revolution that a lot of people think they're going to lose their jobs because of AI. Well, that's what they were thinking in those days. So they didn't want Lincoln to be president. He did become president. So there was a couple drafts. 1861 was one of the first ones. And the riots were actually in 1863. But in 1861 is when John the First uh, signed up or was drafted. Not sure on that. I see his draft card. So he was signed up and he was assigned to the 15th Artillery Engineering Division out of New York City. And there's a museum, as we mentioned last time, I think we talked about briefly in Saratoga about the history of that of warfare and especially the Civil War. There's a museum in Saratoga, a military museum about that. He was drafted or joined from 1861-63. He was in the Civil War. His job was in the engineering division to build bridges, to build boats, to repair damage. They followed the main army. So, according to the records, he actually was in the Battle of Gettysburg and some of the other major battles of the Civil War. He came in probably after they weren't in the midst of the fighting, but some of them did get killed. And again, he survived. A lot of them died of, things like measles and diphtheria and other types of contagious diseases or foodborne diseases. 600,000 died, and probably 400,000 of those were due to diseases. Anyway, again, he survived. Comes back to New York City, 1863. Another draft. Lincoln created another draft. If you had $400, you got out of it. A lot of rich people got out of it. Anyway, just like today, or like the Vietnam War, same thing. So a lot of parallels as you look through history. Anyway, being poor, a lot of Irish immigrants were drafted in 1863, and a resistance to that draft edict was in July of 1863. For 3 days, the Irish from down right near where they lived on 19th Street, 2nd Avenue, Gramercy Park area. Some of the riots were in Gramercy Park, and others extended up to 47th Street. The police could not contain them. This lasted 3 days. Lincoln brought in some of the troops, federal troops, to fight them back. He was successful after 3 days. About 120 to 200, some people even say more, many injured, Black people mainly, some were lynched. There's pictures or drawings of them being lynched. Uh, Buildings burned, churches burned, driven out of their homes, and so forth. So a pretty black area of our history in that time. There's not much of a record. I've been looking at records. Not much of a record of many people being punished for a felony or murder or whatever. Very few people were arrested. Most of them were not. If they were, they were not tried. So there wasn't much punishment resulting from that. But that picture depicts some of the buildings being burned there. So that was a dark history, I think, in the northern part of the United States for those 3 days. But okay, so that's 1863. So we're up to that point now.
Yeah, another obstacle they overcame. They just faced so much here. It makes you wonder what the hardships were like in Ireland during the famine compared to the hardships they faced here in New York City, you know?
Right. Well, they had more. They had more. I guess they had more access to food than they would have in
Yeah.
Ireland. There was no access to other kinds of food. That's why a lot of them died. So they did have access to food, but some of that food might have been contaminated. So that's a downside. They did have access to jobs, so they became independent, whereas in Ireland, the only jobs were the workhouses and so forth. So they did have access to jobs. Some of them did really well. I haven't mentioned that. Some of them, and evidently our family was one of them because that next generation, John Keating II, goes on to get a very good job. His three boys, he had three boys, and he married Ann Daly, who was Ann Keating. She died in childbirth on her fourth child. So the three boys survived, and all three of them went to college. One went to become a teacher at Fordham. One went to an engineering school. Our grandfather, he got a civil engineering degree, and the other one got a pre-law degree. So all three of them, name was Arthur, John, and Joe. Those are the three surviving. Joe went on to serve in World War One, by the way. So, and he had a wife she also died in childbirth. So they had no children. Arthur, same thing. Arthur had his wife die in childbirth. So just within that family, 3 out of 4 lost their wives to childbirth. Two of them, the first child. So they lost their wives. They became widowed. So that was a hardship. I mean, they didn't have the medical care. That's something we haven't mentioned. There certainly wasn't the medical care. There was no antibiotics. And so a lot of people there was a lot of women died in childbirth, a lot of young babies died, and so the average life expectancy in that 1860, 70 time were about 45 years old. So let this last part then, what did John the First? So John the First died of typhus, which is a contamination of water or food. And I have his death certificate. He contracted it, and then 8 weeks later he died. The doctor actually has some information down, some of his symptoms, and he died on January the 1st, 1873. Again, still lived on 19th Street and Second Avenue. He was 46 years old, so he probably exceeded a little bit the average life expectancy. And he was buried in Queens, New York. Actually, he was buried, I don't remember exactly, but he was buried in a different cemetery. When his wife died, they reinterred him. They moved his body to be near her in that other cemetery in Queens. So
Yeah, so this is
anyway, yeah,
thank
go
you
ahead
for that.
now.
This is another cemetery that, people could visit if they wanted to, Calvary Cemetery, where he is
Always.
buried. But yeah, so John Keating one was that original relative who came over and sacrificed so much.
Yeah.
I want to transition to briefly just talk about, the our family who did initially come into New York City. I know some of them stayed in New York City, and then some of them ended up going initially to Long Island, Bolton Landing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the next generation, so we go down to John the Third. That was John Keating was the son of John the Second. He was born in about 1888, I believe, and he went on to get a degree, like I said, in engineering. And in 1930 or so, he told me this himself. He's 1930 or so, the jobs kind of dried up. We have a picture of him too in his pie hat and so forth as an engineer, as surveying equipment. And he just said there was no more jobs during the Depression. So he took a job as a truant officer for the city schools. And in that job, he was rounding up kids that were skipping schools and all that stuff. So he did that the rest of his life and got a pension. His son was my father, Natalie's grandfather, and that was Joe Keating, named after his uncle, Joe Keating. And after World War II, he worked in the bank. My father worked in the bank in New York City before the war during the Depression and earned an associate degree, got 2 year degree in business. And he was really the first one from this generation, my father's generation, to get any kind of a degree. The rest of them really never got a degree. He was really the only one to get any kind of a degree. He decided he wasn't going to work in that bank, even though they offered him a job back. He moved up to New York, northern New York, near the town of Bolton Landing on Lake George, because they had a cousin, my grandmother, John Keating III's wife. Um, she was, we called her Ma. Uh, she was a Maxie, and she was able to connect with this picture over there. She was able to connect with her first cousin, Anisha. So he was a cousin of hers, first cousin of hers. And she, on a whim, they went over and visited him in Bolton Landing. And he was able to, or they sparked their interest. They liked that. They thought that was great. So every summer they went up there for about 5, 6 years. They went up and took a summer vacation in Lake George, in Bolton Landing, and they rented a house. So my father and then his brother John decided they wanted to move up there after World War II. So they went up there and they lived with the children of the Nishas for a while. And Jack was just telling me recently that my mother, when they were living with them in the winter, she fell through the ice walking out towards Dome Island. She fell into the ice and they all rescued her in Lake George in the middle of winter. So she never had a good experience doing that. But anyway, they moved up there. My father got many different jobs. He worked with the Sagamore. He worked, and they bought a house up there in Bolton Landing. It was very cold in the winter, so they both moved down to Glens Falls. So they were the first ones to move away from New York City. The rest of the family, uh, the ancestors of John the Third, they all stayed in the New York City area or they moved out to Long Island. Many moved out to Long Island, Lindenhurst and other places in central Long Island. And they would always visit us up in Bolton Landing in the summer. We had all of them coming up to that big house that they rent as a boarding house in Bolton Landing, and they would come up and visit on the weekend and so forth. We saw a lot of them, but none of them did move up until the Silves. Joan Keating, my father's sister, did. They moved up a while later, so they did move to the Glens Falls, Lake George area. But that's Ma. That's Ma, and he was Florence was her official name. And here's another picture. I mentioned her, Anna Daly Keating. She was married to John II, died in childbirth 1901, and she had three boys, and she was 41 years old. And here's over here, the far right of the picture with a pie hat. That's my grandfather, Natalie's great grandfather. He was a civil engineer, and you can see some of the surveying equipment. Like I said, he quit that